More motorcycles entered American roads between 1960 and 1969 than had existed in the entire country for the previous 60 years of the machine's existence. That number alone should stop you. But the number is the least interesting part of the story. What changed in the 1960s was not just how many Americans owned motorcycles. What changed was why they owned them, who was selling them, what the machines represented, and what happened to the working class culture that had built the foundation when the middle class arrived and decided motorcycles were interesting. The Honda CB750 had not yet arrived. That was 1969, the last year of the decade, a machine that would redefine everything. The Kawasaki Z1, the Yamaha RD350, the Japanese sport bike revolution, all of that was still ahead. What the 1960s produced was the transition, the hinge decade. The 10 years when the motorcycle stopped being a machine you bought because you needed it and started being a symbol you bought because of what it said about you. And I want to tell you exactly how that happened, because the specific forces that transformed motorcycle culture in the 1960s, the Honda marketing campaign that reached mainstream America, the British invasion that brought cafe racers, and the Triumph Bonneville to every garage in the country, the Vietnam War that sent a generation of young men to learn how to be comfortable with risk, and the single film released in July 1969 that made the motorcycle into the most powerful symbol of personal freedom in American popular culture, those forces did not serve the working class culture, they transformed. They replaced it. Understanding the 1960s is understanding the moment the trade was made, and understanding what was traded away. Before we talk about what the 1960s changed, we have to be specific about what existed before those changes arrived, because the mythology of motorcycle culture tends to start with Easy Rider, or the 1970s chopper scene, or the Hollister incident, and in doing so it erases 40 years of American motorcycle culture that preceded the moment the mainstream discovered it. By 1960, the motorcycle had been a working-class machine for 5 decades. Not a leisure product, not a lifestyle accessory. Transportation. Practical, affordable, maintainable transportation for men who could not yet afford automobiles, who lived in cities where a machine that could split traffic was more practical than one that could not, who worked in factories and mills and trades where mechanical knowledge was a baseline competency, and maintaining a motorcycle was not a special skill, but simply the application of skills already held. The American Motorcyclists Association had been sanctioning clubs and events since the 1920s. The gypsy tours, the hill climbs, the flat track races that drew working class riders from the surrounding counties to a fairground for a weekend of competition. The AMA had 100,000 members by the early 1960s, not aspiring outlaws, not weekend warriors, not lifestyle consumers. Factory workers, machinists, tradesmen, men who rode because the machine was useful and loved because the machine was honest. The dominant machines of 1960 were American and British. Harley-Davidson held a significant share of the super heavyweight category. The British manufacturers, Triumph, BSA, Norton, had been expanding their American market presence since the 1950s and had developed devoted followings in the process. The Triumph Bonneville, introduced in 1959, was the machine that serious riders who wanted performance without a Harley size and weight were choosing. It handled. It responded. It made a sound unlike anything the American factories were producing. A new Harley-Davidson Sportster in 1960 cost approximately $1,200. A Triumph Bonneville was similar in price. A factory worker earning the median industrial wage of around $5,000 per year could buy either machine for roughly 2.5 months of gross income. The motorcycle was genuinely accessible to the working class rider who prioritized it. The culture around these machines was built on knowledge. The 1960 motorcycle rider who bought a Triumph Bonneville understood that he was buying a machine with certain characteristics: a tendency toward vibration at a high RPM, a requirement for regular valve adjustment, a specific carburetor tuning sensitivity that rewarded attentiveness and punished neglect. He understood this because the culture transmitted this understanding. Older riders taught younger riders. Clubs maintained archives of mechanical knowledge. The dealer who sold you the machine was often the man who had ridden the same model for years and could tell you from personal experience what it needed. That culture, dense, specific, requiring genuine competence, was what existed in 1960. It was not glamorous by any mainstream standard, it was not photographed by Life magazine, it was not the subject of Hollywood films, it was men who understood machines, riding them on weekends and maintaining them in garages, and transmitting knowledge to each other through direct conversation. It was real in a way that what replaced it was not. In 1959, Honda opened its first American subsidiary in Los Angeles. The machines they brought, the Honda Dream, the Super Cub, small displacement reliable commuters that bore almost no resemblance to the Harley Knucklehead or the Triumph Bonneville in either appearance or purpose, were not immediately recognized as a threat by the American manufacturers. They were regarded as toys, underpowered, unserious, the machines of people who were not yet ready for real motorcycles. The American manufacturers' failure to take Honda seriously is one of the most documented cases of competitive blindness in manufacturing history, and it produced consequences that permanently altered the American motorcycle landscape. The You Meet the Nicest People on a Honda campaign launched in 1963, created by the advertising agency Gray Advertising in partnership with Honda's American management. The campaign was the most consequential piece of motorcycle marketing in American history. Not because it sold motorcycles, though it sold enormous numbers of motorcycles, but because it changed who believed motorcycles were for them. The Nicest People campaign ran in mainstream publications, Life magazine, Saturday Evening Post. It showed ordinary Americans, housewives, doctors, teachers, college students on Honda motorcycles in suburban settings, picnics, shopping trips, campus rides. The images were deliberately, carefully constructed to position the Honda motorcycle as the opposite of the outlaw biker image that Hollywood and Life magazine itself had spent 15 years constructing. The message was explicit and effective. This is not that. The motorcycle you see in these photographs is not the machine of the wild one, or the Hollister rioter, or the one percenter. This is the machine of your neighbor, your doctor, the college student who lives down the hall. This machine is for you if you are the kind of person who reads this magazine and lives in this kind of neighborhood and has these kinds of aspirations. It worked. It worked beyond any metric Honda's American management had projected. Between 1963 and 1965, Honda's American sales grew from approximately 40,000 units to over 200,000 units annually. The company that American manufacturers had dismissed as a toy manufacturer had become the most important force in American motorcycling in less than a decade. I personally think the Nicest People campaign is the single most important piece of cultural work in the history of American motorcycle culture. Not because it was good for the culture, but because it fundamentally changed what the culture was about. Before the campaign, motorcycle culture was defined by people who rode motorcycles. After the campaign, motorcycle culture was also defined by people who were attracted to what motorcycles represented. Those are not the same constituency, and they do not want the same things from the machine or from each other. While Honda was building the mainstream middle-class market from the bottom, the British manufacturers were doing something entirely different at the top. They were creating the most technically and aesthetically sophisticated motorcycle culture America had ever seen, and they were doing it through machines that demanded genuine skill and rewarded riders who developed it. The Triumph Bonneville T1 became the aspirational machine of the early 1960s for riders who wanted performance. Steve McQueen rode Triumphs. Evel Knievel started on Triumphs. The Bonneville was the machine associated with the world's most physically and technically demanding motorcycle racing, the Isle of Man TT, and that association gave it a credibility that no American machine was matching in the early part of the decade. The cafe racer culture that developed around the British bikes in the early 1960s was the most technically engaged motorcycle culture the country had seen. Cafe racers, named for the practice of racing between London cafes, specifically the Ace Cafe, where riders would set a record time for a predetermined route, were not choppers. They were the opposite of choppers. Where the chopper extended and lowered and simplified, the cafe racer tightened and lightened and refined, clip-on handlebars, rear-set foot pegs, a lean-forward, aggressive riding position that put the rider in dialogue with the machine rather than lounging away from it. The cafe racer rider of the early 1960s knew his machine completely. The BSA Gold Star that was the premier British single-cylinder competition machine required setup knowledge that went beyond what any manual provided. the specific carburetor needle clip position for your altitude and temperature, the ignition advance curve that your particular engine had developed over its service life, the specific tension on the primary chain that balanced wear against power loss. These were not factory settings. They were personal knowledge developed through miles and attention. The British manufacturers were, by the mid-1960s, beginning to show the cracks that would eventually destroy them. Labor relations at the British factories had deteriorated badly. Production quality was inconsistent. The engineers who were developing the machines were not always in communication with the management who were pricing and positioning them. Triumph was producing extraordinary machines alongside poorly assembled ones. BSA was struggling with management decisions that its workers disagreed with, and its customers were beginning to notice. But in the early 1960s, before the Japanese manufacturers had fully demonstrated what engineering discipline and production quality could produce at scale, the British bikes were the technical standard against which everything else was measured. And the culture they built in America in that period, technically demanding, aesthetically specific, built around genuine riding competence, was the most sophisticated motorcycle culture the country had produced. That culture would be buried under the avalanche of the late 1960s. But it existed, and its existence mattered. If you're watching this and thinking about someone who rode in the 1960s, a father, an uncle, an older friend who has been trying to tell you about what motorcycles were before Easy Rider changed everything, send them this video right now. Not later. Now. The story of the Honda Nicest People campaign and what it did to a culture that had been building honestly for 40 years is the story most motorcycle documentaries skip entirely. Share it to any group where riders gather, Facebook groups, family chats, anywhere riders talk. The culture that gets forgotten is the culture that got covered up. Every share matters. The 1960s motorcycle story cannot be told without Vietnam. Not because Vietnam caused motorcycle culture, the machines and the clubs and the culture existed before the war, but because Vietnam sent a specific generation of young men through a specific set of experiences that made motorcycles, when they came home, the most natural object in the world for what they needed. Between 1964 and 1973, approximately 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam. The peak years of deployment were the mid to late 1960s. Men who were 18 and 20 in 1965 and 1966 were in Vietnam. Men who had grown up in the early years of the motorcycle expansion, who had seen the Honda advertising and the British bikes and the beginning of the chopper scene, were now in a conflict that would mark them in ways that no previous generation of American veterans had been marked in quite the same way. The Vietnam War was not the World War II experience. The men who came home from the Pacific and from Europe in 1945 came home to parades, to the GI Bill, to a country that understood itself as having been at war and was grateful for the men who had fought it. The men who came home from Vietnam came home to something more complicated. Some came home to protests. Some came home to indifference. Almost all came home to a civilian society that had been having its own transformations during the years they were away, and that did not always know what to do with men whose experience had been so specifically different. The motorcycle gave these men several things simultaneously. It gave them a machine that demanded the same kind of attentive competence that their training had demanded, a machine that rewarded presence and punished distraction. It gave them a community organized around shared experience and mutual respect rather than around the social hierarchies of the civilian world. And it gave them movement, the specific freedom of being in motion on a road with no particular destination, which is the freedom that is hardest to name, but that veterans who have come home often describe as the thing they missed most. The Vietnam Vets MC, which would eventually become one of the most respected veteran motorcycle organizations in the country, put it in a single sentence that I have been thinking about ever since I first encountered it. They said, "We went away as patriots and returned as outlaws." The motorcycle did not cause that transformation, but it absorbed it. The machine became the place where men who felt rejected by their own country could still build something and belong to something and move through a landscape on their own terms. This is the specific emotional weight that the 1970s motorcycle culture would carry into Sturgis and onto the highways and into the clubs and into the garages, the weight of men who had been somewhere that the civilian world could not reach and who needed a machine that met them at that level. The 1960s planted the seeds. The returning veterans would bring the harvest. While the chopper scene was developing in the garages of the urban and suburban East and Midwest, California was producing an entirely different kind of motorcycle culture that the national press ignored almost completely, one that would eventually produce some of the most technically skilled riders the country had ever seen, and that would provide the foundation for Bruce Brown's On Any Sunday in 1971. The desert racing culture of the American Southwest in the 1960s was built around purpose-built competition machines. The Husqvarna, the Maiko, the Bultaco Persang, and the CZ that had come from European manufacturers who had developed off-road competition technology that American manufacturers were not building. These were not highway machines. They were not even road legal in most configurations. They were built for the specific demands of desert terrain, for the Baja 1000 that was first run in 1967, for the Greenhorn Enduro and the Elsinore Grand Prix, and the events that drew the serious off-road community of California, Nevada, and Arizona. Malcolm Smith, who would become one of the most recognizable faces in American off-road competition, was developing his skills in the California desert in the 1960s on machines that required a level of mechanical knowledge and physical capability that the highway rider rarely needed. The desert does not permit incompetence. A machine that fails 20 miles from the nearest road on a day when the temperature is 105 degrees is not an inconvenience. It is a survival situation. The Scrambler, a machine designed for mixed use, capable on road and off, with high-mounted exhaust pipes that could clear obstacles and a suspension travel generous enough to handle terrain that would destroy a standard road bike, was the 1960s version of what we now call the adventure motorcycle. The Honda CL72 Scrambler, the Triumph TR6 Trophy, the BSA Victor. These were the machines of riders who were not interested in the style statement of the chopper, but in the practical expansion of where a motorcycle could take you. Steve McQueen understood what these machines were. McQueen began racing motorcycles seriously in the early 1960s, and by the middle of the decade was competing in the International 6 Days Trial, the most demanding off-road competition in the world, as part of the United States team. He won a silver medal at the 1964 ISDT. That achievement, not the Great Escape motorcycle jump, not the bullet car chase, is the actual measure of what McQueen was on a motorcycle. He was a serious competitive rider who could represent his country in international competition. McQueen's visibility brought attention to the off-road culture in a way that the California desert racing community had not received before. Riders who had known McQueen as an actor discovered that he was also a genuine motorcycle competitor. The machines he rode, the Husqvarna and the ISDT, the Indian motorcycle and On Any Sunday, were not the Captain America chopper of the Hollywood imagination. They were functional, unromantic, purpose-built competition machines that asked their riders to be completely competent. By 1967, something was happening in American culture at large that was going to profoundly change the meaning of the motorcycle in ways that neither the working-class riders, nor the British bike enthusiasts, nor the California desert racers had anticipated or would have chosen. The counterculture had been building through the early 1960s, in the coffee houses of Greenwich Village, in the college campuses where students were organizing against the Vietnam War, in the neighborhoods of San Francisco where a specific utopian urban experiment was underway. The counterculture was not primarily a motorcycle culture. It was a music culture, a political culture, a culture of specific substances and specific aesthetics and specific rejections of mainstream American values. But the motorcycle connected to the counterculture for the same reason it connected to the Vietnam veterans. It represented freedom from the institutional structures that both groups were rejecting. The motorcycle did not answer to a schedule. It did not require a specific route. It moved through space on terms that the rider set rather than terms that the infrastructure imposed. For a counterculture that was explicitly rejecting the architecture of mainstream American life, the motorcycle was a natural symbol. The problem, and I want to be precise about this because it matters for everything that followed, is that the counterculture's relationship to the motorcycle was primarily symbolic. The men who had built motorcycle culture through the 1940s and the 1950s and into the 1960s had a relationship to the machine that was mechanical, practical, competence-based. The counterculture had a relationship to the motorcycle that was primarily about what it meant to ride one, which is a fundamentally different thing. When a machine becomes a symbol before it becomes a tool, the people who adopt it for its symbolic meaning do not develop the relationship with the machine that the tool demands. They buy the statement, they wear the costume, they attend the events. And the culture that was built on the requirement of genuine knowledge begins to accommodate people who have not met and do not intend to meet that requirement. This is not a moral critique of the counterculture. It is an accurate description of what happened to motorcycle culture when the counterculture discovered it. The same process would happen again in the 1980s when the baby boomers with disposable income discovered Harley-Davidson. The same process would happen again in the 2000s when American Chopper made custom motorcycles into a television entertainment product. Every time a machine becomes a symbol to a new demographic, the culture built on knowledge of the machine has to decide what to do with people who want the symbol without earning the knowledge. In October 1968, Honda unveiled the CB750 at the Tokyo Motor Show. It arrived in American dealers in 1969 for $1,495. The CB750 had 4 cylinders. It had a disc brake on the front. It featured electric start. It produced 70 horsepower. It accelerated from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. It had a top speed of over 120 miles per hour. It was faster than anything Harley-Davidson was producing. It was more reliable than anything the British manufacturers were producing. It was $500 less than a comparable American or British machine, and it started every time you pressed the button. The motorcycle press called it the superbike. The designation stuck because nothing better described what it was, a machine that redefined what a production motorcycle could be. It demonstrated by its mere existence that the quality and performance standards the American and British industries had been accepting were not limitations of the technology, but limitations of ambition and investment. For the American manufacturers, the CB750 was not a competitive challenge. It was a verdict. Harley-Davidson's response was to lean harder into identity, the emotional meaning of the American machine, the tradition, the culture. The British manufacturer's response was inadequate investment in engineering and production quality until it was too late. Both strategies would eventually prove insufficient. The CB750 had demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated. A motorcycle could be extraordinary and affordable and reliable simultaneously. Every manufacturer that did not match all 3 of those conditions simultaneously was now operating under a competitive disadvantage that no amount of cultural positioning could permanently overcome. For the culture at large, the CB750 arrived in the same year as Easy Rider. The 2 events together, the machine that proved the future belonged to engineering, and the film that made the motorcycle into the defining symbol of American freedom, completed the transformation that the decade had been building toward. Easy Rider opened in July 1969, written by Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper, directed by Hopper. Budget approximately $400,000. Box office approximately $60 million. One of the most profitable films in Hollywood history relative to its cost. The film follows 2 motorcycle riders, Wyatt, played by Peter Fonda, and Billy, played by Hopper, as they ride from Los Angeles to New Orleans on the proceeds of a cocaine sale. The Captain America chopper ridden by Wyatt, stars and stripes paint, long raked forks, high-rise handlebars, became the most recognized motorcycle in American history within weeks of the film's release. The film's thesis, stated in its tagline, was, "A man went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere." The motorcycle was the vehicle of the search, not just literally as the machines the characters rode, but symbolically. The motorcycle represented the possibility of a freedom that the America the characters encountered could not accommodate. What the film did to motorcycle culture was not what the motorcycle culture would have chosen. The working-class riders who had built the culture through 40 years of garages and races and clubs did not see themselves in the Captain America chopper or in Peter Fonda's sunglasses. The California desert racers who were competing in the ISDT did not see themselves there. The British bike enthusiasts who had spent years learning to tune a Bonneville carb did not see themselves there. What Easy Rider did was create a new constituency for motorcycles, the largest single constituency motorcycles had ever had, composed of people who were drawn not to the machine, but to the symbol. Young men in 1969 and 1970 who walked into motorcycle dealerships asking for something like that were not asking for a machine to maintain and understand and develop a relationship with. They were asking for the symbol, for the freedom the film had shown them, for the specific visual language of the Captain America chopper. The comment in the rise and fall of Chopper's video with 803 likes says it most directly. You never mentioned the biggest influence on the radical choppers of the 1960s and 1970s, LSD. It is an irreverent observation that contains a real insight. The extreme chopper, the machine with forks extended to the point of handling difficulty, sissy bars reaching into the sky, a visual statement that overwhelmed any practical consideration, was not the natural evolution of the motorcycle as a tool. It was the natural evolution of the motorcycle as a symbol. It was art, not engineering. Beautiful in the specific way that impractical things built with genuine skill are beautiful. And like all art made purely for visual impact, it had a natural limit. The specific irony of Easy Rider, the film that made the motorcycle into the most powerful symbol of American freedom in popular culture, is in its ending. The Captain America chopper is destroyed by men in a pickup truck who cannot tolerate the freedom it represents. The film that made millions of Americans want a motorcycle did so by showing a motorcycle being destroyed. The freedom the motorcycle symbolized was shown to be something that the America it was searching through could not protect. Easy Rider changed everything about who thought motorcycles were for them. If you know a rider who was young in 1969 and remembers what happened to the motorcycle culture they had known before that film arrived, share this video with them. And if you are a rider who got into motorcycles because of a film, a symbol, an image, share it with the person who taught you that the machine demanded more than admiration. Send it to your writing group. Post it anywhere writers talk. The history of how this culture was transformed from something built on knowledge into something built on symbol is the history that explains everything that followed. By the end of 1969, the decade's transformation was complete. 5 million registered motorcycles would arrive within 5 more years. The culture had been split between the working class knowledge culture that had built it and the symbol culture that the decade's marketing and filmmaking had created, between the CB650 that represented the engineering future and the Captain America chopper that represented the symbolic present, between the writers who had been there before the mainstream discovered it and the writers who came because the mainstream suddenly decided motorcycles were interesting. The specific forces that drove the transformation were 5 in number, and none of them were motivated by the interests of the culture they were transforming. Honda's You Meet the Nicest People campaign was motivated by Honda's interest in selling motorcycles to the American middle class. That it also stripped the working class culture of its social exclusivity was a consequence, not a goal. The counterculture's adoption of the motorcycle was motivated by the counterculture's need for symbols of freedom. That it brought to the culture a large constituency of symbol seekers rather than machine understanders was a consequence, not a goal. Easy Rider was motivated by Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper's interest in making a film. That it created the largest single cohort of new writers the culture had ever seen, most of whom wanted the symbol rather than the machine, was a consequence, not a goal. Vietnam produced the most mechanically and psychologically capable generation of writers the culture had ever absorbed. That their culture's public image would be defined by the symbol seekers rather than by them was not their choice. The CB750 was Honda's engineering response to a competitive opportunity. That it made the British manufacturer's products uncompetitive and accelerated the collapse of the industry that had produced the most sophisticated American motorcycle culture of the decade was a consequence, not a goal. No single actor in the 1960s chose to transform motorcycle culture from a knowledge culture into a symbol culture. The transformation happened through the intersection of forces that were each pursuing their own interest. The culture that resulted, the 5 million registered motorcycles, the chopper boom, the Easy Rider generation, was the outcome of those interests colliding, not the product of anyone's design. I personally think that is the most important thing to understand about the 1960s motorcycle story. What was lost in that decade was not taken by anyone with bad intentions. It was transformed by forces that had no particular interest in preserving what existed. That is usually how things that matter are lost.